Hello everyone! So I'm going to start one of our experiments in this tank. So, as you can see, I've got a lot of extra plant matter I got to get rid of. We're going to do that first, but what we're doing today is we're going to set up our first air test of the Tetra Whisper against the new Aquarium Co-Op air pump. It's going to be really, really simple. We're going to clear out all this excess plant matter. The canister filter that normally works on this tank is going to be turned off, and the regular air stone will be removed. In its place, the Whisper and the Co-op pump will both be attached to a Aquarium Co-op medium sponge using an air stone and a check valve. They'll all have the exact same length of air tube, same type of air tube. I've already pre-measured and cut all that stuff. So let's get to work, get this thing cleared out, get our equipment in there, and talk about how that experiment's going to go going forward and how we're going to measure how each one compares to the other. Okay, so before we get stuff, you can see I've cleared the plant matter out, right? Before we get going, so I have a decibel meter that I downloaded on my phone. Something easily that any of us can access and use and vet. So here's our two air pumps, right? We're first going to measure the noise, no tubing, no anything, using a decibel meter. I'm going to hand hold these so they're not rattling against anything other than my hands. But that'll give us an idea of how loud they are bass in a slightly more measurable thing compared to our previous video. So we're going to start with the Co-op pump here. It's on battery mode right now just because it's simple, but I've got this thing fully charged. This is the brand new one. So here you can see with an app on it, this is Sound Meter. This is you can get this from the Android or Apple Store. Very easy, free app. And what we're going to do is, first we'll get quiet and I'll let you see if this will focus. So you can see it's kind of bouncing around as far as its sound is concerned, but we'll put this directly by the microphone and get a reading, and I'll tell you what that is after I show you, all right? If I do the same thing here, I'm seeing about 53 decibels before I start talking. It's pretty quiet. We'll set this aside. And now we'll move on to the Whisper. Let me turn this thing on. It doesn't have a handy-dandy battery. I'll tell you, this is going to be a lot louder. So similar distance, about 63 decibels on the Whisper. Now keep in mind that's handheld. That's getting this outlet in both cases about an inch away from the microphone on my cell phone with a simple app. This isn't super scientific, but this gives us a little gauge of the difference in volume in decibels using a fairly simplistic meter. As a reminder, we're going to talk about the equipment we're using. I picked up a couple of medium coarse sponge filters from the Aquarium Co-op. You guys will recognize these. They're brand new in box. Simple. We're going to have the sponge, uplift tube, a little Zis air stone, and your atypical check valve. I've measured everything so that each length of tubing, I'm just using that Aquarium Co-op air tubing, right? I went to my local fish store, picked up all the supplies rather than doing anything too crazy. All the measurements are the same. Okay, so the length from the pump to the check valve, from the check valve into the top of the sponge filter, and then from the sponge filter's inlet to this air stone that'll go a little further inside the outlet will all be exactly the same. All this is designed to do is basically minimize any differences or variables. From there, what we're going to do is we're going to have both sponge filters on this side of the tank right here. This is where the plants aren't planted into the substrate, so it's open. They're both going to sit side by side, so they're on the same tank, drawing into the same zone. This should give us flow that's pulling and doing this. And what we're going to do is let that run for about a month. After that month, what we're going to do is this is the only source of filtration for picking up particulates. We've got some plants in there to help our bacterial colony, all that kind of stuff, but we're going to use this as our particulate matter, and what we're going to do is see which one appears to be more full of stuff when we go and clean it out, how much more rinsing does one take over the other to get to a certain point. I know this isn't super scientific, but basically what I'm looking for is, can we visually look at these two sponges and see that one might be pushing more flow and it's picked up more particulates of food over time in the same tank right side by side. Kind of a simple experiment, I know, but we'll also look at how much air we're seeing come out of these sponges at depth. And I've got some interesting comments from a viewer who's going to give us some extra details. So let me get these set up, and then we'll take a quick look at them and talk about some very interesting feedback I got from a viewer who's been doing some tests of their own on the Aquarium Co-Op pump. Okay, so we've got both the sponges in there. They're both running. You can see just in the background, but we'll have some B-roll here in a sec that I'll show you. They really look like they're about the same flow at depth. This is a 29 gallon. Keep that in mind. There's probably a tiny, minuscule difference because of the substrate, as far as like one being a millimeter or two higher than the other. But I did my best to keep them about even. So all the lengths, everything, they're all set up. We're going to run these for a month. There's no restriction at all. It's just into the check valve and straight in. There's nothing tamping either of the two down. So we'll see. We'll see what it gives us for results. I mean, we're not looking for something super scientific here. I'm sure somebody's going to comment on the water level. It's easier to work on water level. I'm going to top it off. Don't worry. But we're going to let this little tank with its rainbows do its thing. I will keep the canister filter. I have it tamped down so it's barely flowing, but just enough so there's some biological colony established for a week. I'm going to give these sponges a little bit of time, then I'm going to remove the equipment and run them for about a month. Then we'll check back in, see where we're at, and then we'll do a few more experiments. But while I have your attention, let me get on my phone, because I have an email from a viewer that has some really, really cool data. And I want to talk about his experiments personally. He's also a tester. We're going to go into some details. I'm going to read a lot of this email. But I said, I loved your teardown of the Aquarium Co-Op pump, but I wanted to see more, so I bought one myself. I noticed a few things about it that weren't either in either video, plus a design flaw. I thought you might be interested if you're going to make a longer-term follow-up video review. Also, just because you're a test engineer too. I'll let the co-op know. So he let him know about the flaw. Cool. So number one, he says, it comes with a UL power supply. The nano pump never did, but given how many times you've heard Corey say how important that it is to him on live streams, I was surprised the nano didn't. I imagine that's just because the nano is repurposed, where they actually did some serious minor changes here and there when it comes to the engineering of this pump. And I know Corey's mentioned that. I don't have the direct reference, but there is some changes in this compared to like the other ones that are out there. So that's important to know. Two, the website says it consumes 3.5 watts of power. From my testing, the most it draws is about 1.5 watts. Less power is good, in his opinion. So Chris is of the opinion that having less power and still pushing a good amount of air is very good. And I would agree, less power is pretty awesome. You don't want a pump that draws like too much power, right? But very interesting that it draws very differently. After charging it, it actually takes less power to run than the nano pump. Think about that. This is a much more powerful pump, and after charging it, it requires less power when it's in a fully charged battery state running off of AC power. That's pretty impressive. It does note that after charging, it actually takes less power to run unless you trim the resistor in the nano pump. So you have to doctor it to make the nano take less power. Super interesting. Number three, the 18650 battery, so that's the battery that's inside, right, is unusually light. Turned out to be only 35 grams with the connector. I tested mine at only 750 milliamp hour capacity, about half to one-third the capacity of a typical 18650 you find out there. A lot of people, like, if you use a vapor rig or some gimbals use 18650 batteries, and basically it comes down to is what the actual milliamp hours is. The common ones I tend to see from the ones that are used in gimbals, which is where I'm most familiar with them, typically rather 3000 milliamp hours. So with it being 750 milliamp hours, that makes a little sense of why it's light. it only has so much capacity. But granted, that pump draws so little power, it really doesn't need a lot. Let me continue with what he has to say here, though. My runtime test showed it ran for 6 hours, but there's potential to get it to run for almost a day if you had a much larger battery inside there. And I imagine it has to do something with the cost of batteries and not trying to make the pump too expensive, or maybe something that has to do with international freight of those batteries. I'm not too concerned. I think 6 hours is pretty good in the full-on mode and not the power save, but for some very enterprising people, you might be able to do something even more impressive. Number 4. I did a flow rate test under 9 inches of water. A little bit more over here. He just filled a graduated cylinder or measuring cup with water to submerge it, then flipped it over and pump air into it while measuring time. If that makes sense, that's basically how you get a relatively accurate measurement of how much air is actually being pushed in, and when you seal it, right, in order to do certain things with the liquid. The runtime test, I got 0.6 liters per minute. Perhaps it does better under ideal conditions, no airline, not bubbling in water, and that could be just how a lot of these things are measured. I'm curious if we were to do that, the same measurement. I don't have the correct tools to do that, unfortunately. I don't have a proper graduated cylinder and some of those things. I could probably look into it, but Chris, if you are interested, because I know you're kind of near me, I have several spare Whisper 40s. If you'd like to test one of those and do a similar test and give me that data, I'll be at the GSAS auction next week from when this video debuts, so you know how to get a hold of me. Let me know. I'll give you one. I'll give it to you if you want to do the same test on a Whisper. That way we can compare the two that I'm comparing here. Anyway, the same test showed the nano pump at about 0.15 liter per minute. So assuming it's kind of a testing method thing. And then 5, the charging circuit power supply has a potential bug. The pump is powered directly off battery, but the charge circuit isn't designed for that. This means under normal running, it's continual float charging the battery, which is bad for the long-term health of a lithium-ion battery. I have a feeling it's not necessarily a flaw. I have a feeling it's designed to minimize some of the extra costs in order to do it like perfect, as far as like a hardware engineer would probably look at doing so. And that's probably just a matter of trying to make sure that we're trying to get a good combination of not making the pump too expensive, but adding some features to an air pump that make it awesome. And I can kind of understand where that change is. I'm sure you'd have to talk directly to a hardware engineer about that, but I can also see where you would be like, that's a design flaw, just from a perspective of how long the battery will last. I don't think it'll impact it too horribly in the grand scheme of things compared to like what we'd expect a standard air pump to live for, but it's interesting to note that. And the final note, it also means that in the modes where the motor current falls too low, like intermittent and the slightly counterintuitively when there's too much back pressure, the charge controller will shut down even when plugged in, and the pump will run on battery for about 20 minutes. Then after the battery is discharged, it will power up and top the battery off. So it's this repeating continuous, like, charge completely, discharge, which is actually kind of bad for the battery. You don't, in any given lithium ion, this happens with electric cars, it happens with a lot of things, you don't want to pump it, basically you want to stay in like the 20 to 80% range to be optimal unless you're on a continuous, very gentle trickle charge. And so that's where you could say this is a design flaw, but I think for the cost of the pump and your expected lifetime out of an air pump like this, it's probably not that bad. It's certainly not optimal, but that would be where I'd sit. So, with that being said, this is our experiment. We're going to check back in about a month. Chris, let me know. I'll email you too, just in case. But that's some data. I hope you guys find it interesting. I find it interesting because I like when other testers like go hog wild, even more hog wild than I normally would, because that's more their area of expertise, and some of those kind of experiments where, I'm not as smart. I'm good at certain things, but not everything, that's for certain. So, anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this. Let me know down in the comments, what did you find interesting? What do you expect out of the test? Is there something you think that I should try in the future when I'm testing the air pumps in methods like this? Let me know. I'm very curious to hear your feedback. As always, guys, Thank you so much for watching, and stay awesome.